Hi everybody, and welcome to this Nelson Primary webinar on Mastery in Explicit Teaching Practices within Structured Literacy Blocks, presented by Jacinta Conway. I'll just give it a moment or so as people continue to join us. Hi everybody, and welcome again. My name is Kate McGough, and I'm the Head of Primary Portfolios here at Nelson. Before we jump in and get started, I'll just take you through some housekeeping. Thank you for joining us today. You will notice that your camera and your microphone are both off. This is to minimise background noise, as there are a few of you on the webinar today. If you do have any questions that come up during the webinar, please pop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will have time at the end for Jacinta to respond. And for any questions that we don't get to, we will follow up with you following the session. For any technical issues, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, which my colleague Jasmine will be monitoring throughout the session. And finally, this webinar is being recorded today, and you will receive a copy of the recording in about a week's time. Okay, so I'm now very excited to introduce Jacinta Conway. Jacinta is an educational consultant and literacy and intervention specialist based in Melbourne. Jacinta has taught in schools for more than 20 years and is the Director of Impact Tuition, where she tutors students and coaches teachers to implement evidence-based learning strategies. She also works at an independent school in southeast Melbourne. I'll now pass over to Jacinta. Thanks, Jacinta.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you for that lovely warm introduction. And thank you all for joining for today's webinar. While it would be lovely to see you all in person, it's just absolutely my delight to be here to share with you my knowledge on enhancing literacy instruction. Before we get started, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country where we are meeting today. Our webinar is being held on the lands of Wurundjeri people, part of the Kulin people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. I'd like to extend my respect to Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today. Today we're going to be delving into the essence of explicit teaching within the framework of structured literacy, focusing on its critical elements and the practical examples from early to upper primary levels. This overview will set the stage for our deeper exploration for the subsequent webinars. Given the context of 3 webinars, there will be more of a focus on certain components of structured literacy in this webinar. As we move forward, our webinar will be guided by clear learning intentions and success criteria, which will help us to see where we're going and keep us on track. Our journey today is about harnessing best practices and applying evidence-based research into our teaching. We recognise that there's various milestones along the way on our road to our knowledge and understanding on our educational path, marking our progress and growth in delivering effective literacy instruction. I thought I'd share some books that are on my bookshelf for explicit teaching that I've picked up along the way. My journey in explicit teaching and structured literacy, I've been doing explicit teaching now for about nearly 20 years, but I was also inquiry-based trained, so I've used a combination depending on the needs of my students. And structured literacy, I probably started learning about structured literacy about 12 years ago. So today's webinar will have a bit of a focus more on the first book that you can see there, Explicit Instruction. So let's get started on the first part, the essence of explicit instruction within the framework of structured literacy. So what is structured literacy? Structured literacy is characterised, by the provision of systematic phonics instruction that integrates listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It emphasises the structure of language across various components like phonology, orthography, syntax, morphology, semantics, and the organisation of discourse. This definition that I'm showing you today is provided by the International Dyslexia Association, which is where the term structured literacy first came from. So the graphic you can see here is also from the IDA, and what you can see on the inside of the IDA is what we teach and what components of language and the structure of language that will be taught in a structured literacy block. So we have phonology, sound symbol, syllables, morphology, syntax and semantics. And on the outside of that graphic, you can see it's how we're going to teach it. So the what and the how. So we're going to teach it using explicit instruction, we're going to be diagnostic, and the content is going to be delivered in a systematic and cumulative way. In our exploration of language and literacy, it's crucial to sort of recognise the foundational components that underpin both areas. The 5 components of language, we have phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. These serve as the building blocks for effective language communication, and each component plays a unique role. Phonology with sounds, morphology with word structures, syntax with sentence construction, semantics with meaning, and pragmatics with the social use of language in social contexts. In literacy, and specifically in reading, we focus on phonemic awareness, systematic and often called synthetic phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. Each of these components align with language components. For instance, you've got your phonemic awareness and systematic phonics, which aligns with phonology. We've got the vocabulary, which aligns with morphology and syntax and semantics. And fluency will go across all components, but there is also a fluency component of reading, as well as the main goal of reading, which is to comprehend. The National Reading Panel, which was published in 2000, emphasised these 5 components of reading: phonemic awareness, systematic phonics, vocab, fluency, and comprehension, as critical elements to be able to teach reading in order to have functional literacy. The adjectives that they used in addition to this were to use explicit instruction and ensuring that it's systematic, direct and focused, mirroring the structured literacy approach that was mentioned earlier. So all these connect and enhance our ability, having this background knowledge, in order to teach literacy more effectively, grounding our instruction in the comprehensive structure of language. Just one moment, my screen's gone a bit different. Okay, models of reading. So we're going to explore several different influential models of reading that guide our understanding and teaching strategies. There's a little QR code in the corner. The information I'm sharing here is a bit of a summary where you can actually get all these models of reading from the Reading Rockets page, but all the models are actually from research. So I'm going to begin with the simple view of reading, which posits that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and language comprehension. It's a straightforward model that emphasises both elements and is essential, and they're interdependent. No reading comprehension can occur without both skilled decoding and the understanding of language. This model has then been further developed using the cognitive foundations model, and here we see an expansion of the simple view. This model expands on the simple view of reading and highlights the foundational components required. You can see we've got the word recognition on the right-hand side, the language comprehension on the left, and underpinning that, the foundational layers, which does include your language components here that you can see, but also our literacy components of concepts of print, letter knowledge, phonemic awareness, and knowledge of the alphabetic principle. Following this model, another model that you will have seen, which links to what's often called with the science of reading, the Scarborough's reading rope. I think for this one, I might just zoom in a bit, okay, so that you can see that a little bit better. So with this one, this model enshrines many skills needed for reading fluency and comprehension, including, you can see here, we've got our phonological awareness and our decoding and vocabulary knowledge. And this is woven together with our language comprehension, which includes background knowledge, vocabulary, our language structures, verbal reasoning and literacy knowledge. And all of this is entwined together to produce skilled reading. Let's see if I can come back out again. From here, another model we have is that's more recent, again, is the active view of reading. And what's interesting about the active view is it includes the simple view. We go back to our word recognition and language comprehension. So word recognition in the blue, the language comprehension, but it also includes self-regulation and executive functioning, which also acknowledges motivation and engagement as a critical component to reading. And then we have our bridging processes here in order to have skilled and efficient reading. Now, of all these, of all these models, sorry, I've just lost my page. I'll just fix that up. If you can see this page now. Of all these models, they all provide teachers with different perspectives and viewpoints of how we can teach reading. The simple view of reading model has been around for a very long time, about equivalent to the same amount of time as the 3 cueing model. But the rest of the models have sort of developed since then as more research has come out. What we do know now is that we have examples that are aligned with structured literacy and best practices and evidence-based research in the science of reading. The 3 cueing model has become less aligned with reading and evidence-based instruction and is not seen as an example that does align with structured literacy. Okay, the next component I wanted to look at here is the 4 phases of word reading and spelling development. And this is from Linnea Airey's model that leans towards orthographic mapping. So what's good about this model is we're looking at reading and stages of reading as well as stages of spelling. So starting over here in the first column, the pre-alphabetic phase, we know that young learners are just beginning to recognise letters and sounds, so they don't yet associate them. And this stage is crucial for introducing letters in engaging and relevant ways. We then move into the partial alphabetic phase, and here students are really starting to learn their phonics and their letter sound connections, but they don't have a complete understanding. And so and in spelling, they'll be able to use it, but they won't be necessarily spelling completely accurately all the time. So this stage is essential for reinforcing phonics, helping children to build their foundational decoding skills and their spelling. We then move to the full alphabetic phase, and in the full alphabetic phase, students develop robust connections between their graphemes and phonemes, which allow them to decode more complex words and expand their spelling abilities. Instruction here focuses on expanding their decoding skills to include multi-syllable words. And finally, we get our consolidated alphabetic phase. And in this phase, we see learners using their skills fluently across contexts and decoding. They're able to decode new and familiar words with ease. They have advanced phonics skills, and they've also got morphological skills of instruction as well, so that they're applying morphological rules into their reading and spelling. So understanding these phases, it actually helps us to have knowledge on what we need to teach and when we need to teach it. But it also gives us a bit of an idea of being able to pinpoint where our students are at in their development, especially in the early years, where we're hoping to establish students being, by the end of the early years, much more towards the concept alphabetic phase. Okay, moving into explicit instruction. Explicit instruction is a cornerstone of effective teaching, and it's characterised by its clarity, directness, and intentionality. Each adjective that we use to describe this approach, we've got explicit, unambiguous, direct. It reinforces the foundational purpose to make learning accessible and understandable for all students. This method includes clear supports and scaffolds. Students are guided through their learning journey with precise statements of purpose, detailed explanations, and methodical demonstrations. And this ensures that every student understands not only what they are learning, but also what is important. The process doesn't stop just at instruction. It really needs to be extended to practice. Okay, so we provide the structured opportunities for practice accompanied by immediate feedback, ensuring students can apply new knowledge and skills confidently and correctly. So to put in summary here, explicit instruction is about making every step in the educational process clear, direct and purposeful, leading to mastery and independence in learning. It's an approach that acknowledges the teacher's role as a crucial guide in unlocking student potential. So going back to those 5 components of reading: phonemic awareness, systematic phonics, vocabulary, fluency and comprehension, these components need to be adjusted to meet the needs of our diverse needs of our students. So you can see here these components sort of equally divided up here in this graphic for how you would be implementing this across the early years of primary. Because in the younger years, the focus needs to lean more towards, even if you block out the phonemic awareness and phonics, and you were blocking those 2 segments out into a 2-hour literacy block, that's a significant amount of time that's required to ensure that these foundational skills are consolidated. As students progress through to the middle and upper, you can see that phonemic awareness and systematic phonics, the component and the amount of time that is used to teach and address these skills is reduced. And that's because it will become embedded into the vocabulary component of instruction, because you're applying the skills that you've already learned from the early years. Of course, this is just a guideline, because we know that in any classroom and at any point in time that we are at, when we're implementing pedagogical approaches as well as content-like approaches like structured literacy, and I would say that's a content-based approach with saying structured literacy, whereas explicit instruction is how we're doing it as a pedagogy. All schools are different and at different points on the road on their journey for what they've already implemented and where their students are at. Okay, so now I'm going to go through what the elements of explicit instruction are. So this book will break down, there's 16 elements all up. There's also like philosophies that go with this. There's principles of explicit instruction, but for time-based restraints, I'm just going to go through what the elements are. So I'll start with the first one. We focus instruction on critical content, and that's what we teach, and we make sure that our teaching sticks to the critical content. We sequence the skills logically, we chunk things down, and we break them down into smaller components. Teaching, we make sure that we design and organise focused lessons. We begin our lessons with a goal, and the lesson is guided by that initial goal. We review prior knowledge and prior skills before we begin the key instruction on the goal. And then we provide step-by-step modelling and demonstrations so that it's very explicit and clear exactly what we want students to know and be able to do. We use clear and concise language so that it's our very first model has the highest rate of success. And then we provide adequate a range of examples and non-examples. Students are provided with guided and supported practice. And then following that, they are required to be given frequent responses, and it's through these frequent responses that teachers can judge whether or not learning is taking place. Teachers obviously monitor the performance carefully, and this is done in alignment with the requiring of frequent responses. We provide immediate, affirmative and corrective feedback, and that's a tightrope balance there to make sure that we get that right. And then we make sure we're delivering our lessons at a brisk pace. We help students organise their knowledge, and finally we provide distributed and cumulative practice. So there's a few different terms there on practice, and we'll be unpacking those as we go. So looking at these 16 elements of explicit instruction, that's quite a lot of information. 16 is beyond our working memory. So I'm going to chunk this down to 4 components. 1, know our content and what we actually need to be teaching. Design our lessons so that they're using the explicit instruction formula, which in essence is the model, do it together, and then the students do it. So it's a gradual release, or the I do, we do, you do. How we deliver our content is using the explicit instruction model, and we provide as much opportunity for practice and all the different types of practice along the way. So that brings us to our part 2 of the critical elements of instruction, where we're going to look at these in more practical sense of what it looks like when we're teaching in classrooms. I'm going to use for this example a scope and sequence that Nelson have got engaged with their scope and sequence for their new decodables. And one of the reasons why I've chosen decodables is because phonics has a finite amount that we need to teach. So it's almost like in maths when you're in foundation years and you're teaching 1 to 20, you know exactly the content that you've got to cover and the concepts that go with it. It's the same with phonics. So it's a really nice concrete way. Whereas when we get into vocabulary, it just broadens very, very quickly, as well as comprehension, which will be covered more in the second webinar. So that's why this webinar is looking more at the decoding skills and spelling to go with it. So what does a scope and sequence like this provide us, and how does this link to the critical elements of instruction? First of all, it supports us to focus instruction on our critical content. What do we must teach so that students must learn this in order to be functional and be able to read and write? How can we sequence these skills logically? So it's already been done for us when we have a scope and sequence. It also supports us to be able to break skills down. So some sets that you'll see here have a lot more content than other sets, but it still gives us that opportunity to say, okay, for example, if I'm looking here, I think if I could go laser pointer, if I'm looking here at set 10, okay, that's quite a heavy unit of work, so we know we need to break that down. It also supports us to design our lessons over the 4 terms of a school year and what our actual lesson plans weekly. So we've got our whole year term, weekly, daily lessons, and what content will go into what. As far as beginning lessons with a clear goal or learning intention, we can use this to frame our goals or learning intentions. It's just one tool that will guide us towards that goal, but it's not the only tool, but I do think it links here. And finally, when you have a scope and sequence, you can see what prior knowledge and previous skills should have been taught when you're looking at this in its scheme of like a sequence of how something is systematically and sequentially taught and introduced. In a school setting, I like to have my content mapped over a 12 months. So what I've done on this next slide is I've taken a spreadsheet and I've put on it, I'll just zoom in here, you can see that I've taken the Australian Curriculum version 9 and I'm just looking at a year 1 level descriptor so we can see what students need to know and be able to do in year 1. And I've just taken the content descriptors from the substrand in literacy and looking at phonics and word knowledge. If we go across this spreadsheet here, you can see I've broken it up into loosely 10-week terms over 4 terms. And then down the columns here, we've got our content descriptors, which I don't think is letting me, sorry, zoom in there. So they're the content descriptors. Underneath, I've put in the sets of the scope and sequence for phonics. So then you can see, just for 2 examples here, we've got yellow and pink. And the point of that is to say here with our yellow content descriptor, this one looks at segmenting words into phonemes, including consonant blends or clusters at beginnings or ends of words. So the 2 examples they've given are the word spoon being the consonant cluster at the beginning, sp, and then the vowel, oo and n, so 4 sound words, and also the consonant cluster at the end of the word, fist, fist. That is addressed in set 8.1 and 8.2. And so I've just highlighted that if you had to address this, this is planned out already in a scope and sequence that's at about the set 8.1 and 8.2 level. On going across here, I've just kind of used a colour code scheme to say our goal is mastery. So green is our goal. And if we move back from that, we've got yellow is where we practice towards mastery, and red is when the skill is introduced or the content or skill is introduced. Black is just there as a challenge, as it might be, you might decide that there are some students in your class that are ready for it. So you might have it acknowledged as a challenge just to demonstrate differentiation for some students, as we know we have that variability. And then I thought I would just acknowledge here that if this was term 1 in year 1, what would we do at the very beginning? Well, I would be planning it out to say, let's just take the first 2 weeks of the term, let's just review content that had been done from the previous year, and because we don't want to introduce anything too complex until we've established our routines and procedures and relationships at the beginning of the school year while we're all getting to know each other. If it's a complex skill, I might have 2 weeks for introducing it, followed by plenty of weeks to practice and assess and use formative assessment to determine where students are at, but overall with the goal of completing and being at mastery by the end of the year. And you can see here with the red, we were just sort of making our way through to more complex skills as we go. So that's just an example of how to practically plan and implement systematic phonics through a year. It would look different in foundation, and it would look different in year 2, and again it would look different in year 3, and it would also look really different depending on how many years of implementation a school has already got in place with their systematic phonics instruction and curriculum. So where do these link to the critical elements? Zooming back out, whoops-a-daisy, hang on a minute. Let me just go back here. So zooming back out, it's got, the focus is on the critical content. We can see that we can use this to sequence, we can break skills down, we can support our lessons, and we can also support it with our lesson goals and expectations. And also it really helps us as teachers to be able to what has already been reviewed so that we can design our daily reviews based on what's happening. If I was going to use this spreadsheet here as a formative assessment tool instead of a planning tool, I might make new versions of it based on my own class formative assessments that I've observed and assessed through instruction. From here, I've wanted to show you that you can break your weekly literacy block using structured literacy into weekly, and I've got 2 blocks here, a P to 2 and a 3 to 6, which I got from my good friend Julie Scarley. So if anyone is interested in looking at Julie Scarley's resources, she has got a lot of free resources for structured literacy on her website. What you'll notice about the P to 2 and the 3 to 6 components is that they both start with a daily review. And then following from the daily review, they then, in P to 2, you'll have phonemic or phonological awareness, phonemic awareness and phonics. In 3 to 6, that will be applied, the phonics will be applied in spelling and vocabulary. Both address fluency and have a component of their structured literacy block which address fluency, and language comprehension is a major chunk of each block. Then you can see that both address writing as well as handwriting. So within this is really the first time I think you get to really see where with the language comprehension as well as reading and language comprehension, this is where you would be having high quality literature that you're including in your literacy block. And you would be reinforcing your comprehension skills very early on through listening skills in the early years of primary, and you'd be reinforcing those skills through both reading and listening comprehension and language comprehension in the middle to upper years in 3 to 6. We can then take our structured literacy block and we can look at it from the, instead of the lens here, we're looking at more content. Okay, but if we break down a lesson plan, we're going back from structured literacy and back into the pedagogical approach of explicit instruction. So here are 2 lessons, and both lessons here, if I zoom in, are focused on the letter U. And one is looking at it just, the one on the left is looking at the letter U saying which means it's probably more of a foundation lesson, whereas the second lesson is really looking at that sound has been established, but you might be exploring the many different sounds that the U can make in year 1 and looking at where the grapheme U is having multiple sounds that are built up as per your scope and sequence. So with that in mind, you can see here we've got clear learning intentions in our lesson plan. We've then got a daily review, and the daily review will look different based on the content. So it'll be much simpler in the one on the left compared to the one on the right. Following on from the daily review, we've got the lesson component of I do, we do, you do. And then from here, the modelling, there's a column here where you've got your modelling. And from there, you've got your key vocabulary and your precise or concise language that you need to use within that. I've used a term here, which I think is, I've seen where you use the if-then language. So for example, if the letter U is in a CVC word, then it is most likely going to say And that's a dialogue and an interactive dialogue that you can develop with your students so that when you say the first part of the sentence, they can say the second. But you can see as you move up to getting more complex, we can continue to say that one as a revision, but then we might say if the letter U is at the end of a syllable, then it is most likely going to say, and it could say you, like in music, or it could even say oo, like in super. So it's just about knowing what we're teaching and what is our critical content at that time and what do we want the students to know and be able to understand. Here you can also see that if the letter U ends in is a CVC and then ends with a silent E, then it will also say U. And depending on your structured literacy approach and the concise language that you choose to use in your context, some might use the term split diagraph and some might choose to say the function of that letter there. It serves a function and it's making the vowel make a certain sound. My preference is to go with the function of letters because sometimes they serve different functions. Sometimes they serve the function of making a sound and sometimes they can serve the function of representing a morpheme. And a really good example of that would be the letter S, where sometimes it says a sound in a word, but often if you see the letter S, is representing a sound as well as saying this is a plural. So knowing our language structure of the alphabetic principle there. Following on from, if I just come out there, we've also got the clear and concise language. All these components here in green are students' opportunities to respond and be interactive, and those frequent responses are really critical, as well as providing that guided and supported practice. And then finally, we have embedded in that the frequent responses. Okay, so we've looked at our 4 components now. We've got our content, we have our design of our lessons, how we deliver them with our 16 components, and finally we've got practice. So I want to now look at these in a more practical way over the next 10 minutes before we have time for questions and answers. Okay, so practical strategies from early to upper primary. So given that I use the letter U as the example there, I've just put up on the screen here some Boardmaker images of words that have the letter U, and depending on the appropriateness of the age and grade level would depend on what I would end up doing with these. I'm now going to just show you what my first goal would be with a daily phonics review. So I have my phonics review here, and let's say that we're looking at the set here where we have the letter D, J, O, G, and U. I think this is set 3 in the scope and sequence. So imagine that if that's where I'm up to my scope and sequence, I would not be reviewing the bottom 2 rows. And I would be doing massed practice, and everyone would be doing the same practice of the graphemes D, J, O, G, U. But the graphemes that come before that, they would be cumulative practice because they've already been introduced. So let's look at what these look like using the term purposeful independent practice. Any new skill is practiced using initial mass practice, and that's so that it goes into short-term retention. And so initial mass practice is used for new skills and it's repeatedly used in isolation. Following on from that, we use something called spaced or distributed practice. Here, this is for long-term retention, and it's a shorter practice session and it's spaced out over time. Following on from that, we have cumulative practice. So cumulative practice is different in that it allows for interleaved practice, and this strategy ensures that students not only recall the most recent material, but they are continually revisiting older content. It's about building up those layers of knowledge where each session recalls and builds on previous sessions. Okay, interleaved practice. This gets more complex here because what you're doing in interleaved is you're practicing multiple skills in one session, and it's really with the goal of getting these content, knowledge and skills into long-term retention and being able to discriminate them when you need them. Okay, this can have practice in several different skills during cumulative practice, or it can be in random order. And finally, we have retrieval practice. And the difference between retrieval practice to all the rest of the types of practice models that I've shown here that we use in explicit instruction is that is used for long-term retention and transfer, but it's also when you're doing retrieval practice, you don't usually have the content in front of you. Okay, so if I was now going to look at the phonics again to do a daily review and you're looking at it in front of you, and let's just take off the bottom 2 layers and say that we haven't done that yet, then this is not retrieval practice because you're looking at it in front of you. Okay, it's only retrieval practice. And a really good example is if instead of looking at the letter M on and saying I would be giving you the sound and you would be retrieving that and you would be writing it. So retrieval is what we would use more for encoding and spelling, which is another reason why spelling is a harder skill to establish. When you're doing a daily phonics review, you want to just show the content that you want them to be looking at. You don't want them to have too much content up on the screen if you are delivering your reviews using PowerPoints like I'm showing you here at the moment. With feedback in mind here, I'm just showing you how you could present the information, but now I'd like to just kind of go into a routine procedure. I might say to you, we're going to do a daily phonics review. Why do we do a phonics review? And I'd be expecting the students to be responding to me. And then I would say, get ready. So that would be a verbal cue. And then I would probably use a hand gesture if I was using a screen like this. And I would say, what sound? And with my hand gesture, I would be expecting them to say, K. What sound? What sound? What sound? Now, I would be listening for precise pronunciation. And if I've got mispronunciation, I would be stopping. And I would say, for example, here with the sound N, I would be listening to say, they all know N, but they might be saying it too long. And we don't really want to have elongated sounds in a classroom and we want to be saying as little as possible, even in our teaching instruction role, because everything here is about listening to precise pronunciation. My immediate feedback might be corrective here to say, just say that nice and short. So I'll take it off, then they would say it again. And the same here, if I hear something that's not quite right, so instead of a D, I might say, I heard a few people say B here. This is D. Can you say D for me? Okay, so this is where you get that immediate feedback and you can select how many times you get the students to say it until you've got everyone saying it in the exact way that you want them to say. Moving on from here, I'll just click through all these sounds. I don't need you to practice every single sound in this webinar with me. Once you've got your phonics and you taught them as initial mass practice and distributive practice, you want to change the order. You don't want your phonics to be in the same order every single time, because if you're doing that, you're doing rote. And that's not the goal. It's the goal here is to be able to automatically recognize the letter sound correspondence. Okay, so we might use rote if we need to, but only if we have to. Personally, I don't prefer to use a PowerPoint presentation. I know they're really good for whole school continuity, but I prefer to use cards so that all the students are actually looking at me and they're not going from a screen and looking away, even looking up to a corner of a screen and then looking back at me. That's still too much transition. I want to keep this so quick, like less than 2 minutes, so that the next time we go through it, it's more about checking for understanding questions. Okay. Keeping in mind that we want this to be also at the upper end, what would this look like as a daily review in upper primary? You might have a mix of complex graphemes, but you'd also be including morphemes, and you might even have them writing the morphemes in their vocabulary notebooks with the meaning of the morpheme, and you might be reviewing it by saying, take out your vocab books, go to your pages on prefixes and read the first column, and then you might be asking check for understanding questions about what's in each of these columns. Okay, following on now with our daily review, I've changed the order up a little bit here. I'm looking at a decodable text that I'm going to be using, which is called A Bug on My Bed. And I'm going to choose, I may not want to do How many have I got here on my screen? 6 5s of 30. I may not even have time in my block to do 30 graphemes today, so I might just select these key graphemes, and I've selected these based on the practice words that are on the inside cover. To make that simpler to see here, I'll put this in 2 lists here. And I'm now going to select all the graphemes that are in pink. These are the ones that are the most new graphemes that have been introduced. So my check for understanding questions are going to be on these graphemes. And this is how I would plan to make sure everybody knows exactly what I want them to know. So I might be saying, for example, in the word big, which sound can you hear at the beginning? I would be asking the students to say "b" in response. So I might be asking questions regarding the beginning sound, the end sound, and with the letter U, I'll be asking them to say the sound "up." You can see in my word list here, I have reduced the amount of words here that have the A sound because I don't want them to confuse "a" and when I'm introducing because they're very easily misunderstood, especially for students who have learning difficulties. I would then get students to segment and blend the words, just as you would, and you would do the I do, we do, you do model. So you might say it, if they're already familiar with it, you would fade that I do, we do, and instead you just have them say them and give feedback if there's anything that's not in sync. Following from this, I would go straight into spelling to make sure that they're making that reading spelling connection. And I might dictate the word. So maybe the word is fun. I would then get them to say the sounds in fun. I might put it into a sentence. So I'm modeling complete sentences every single time I introduce a word. I would have them tick the sounds so that they're acknowledging that. And then I would potentially model the word first, or if they are confident and know this procedure and this routine procedure, for the next word, say it's jug, I would have them write the word jug before I write the word jug. And once I know that they've all done it, they're all looking up, I would then sound and write jug so that they could see it on the board. Having the opportunity to, if you're modelling, you show them the word first, but if you're moving away from the model and you've moved away from the I do, we do, you want them to go to the you do as quick as possible so that they are doing retrieval practice and really consolidating their reading spelling connections. I would also include here with my spelling dictation high frequency words that are in this list, which even if they are complex sounds, if they're my heart words, I would be segmenting and blending. So the word is, and I might say sound out is, and here I might be reinforcing. I know you hear z, but make sure you use the grapheme, which is the letter S. And by this point, they know their language. They know to say letters or sounds. And so you can come in and use a letter name if you need to when they're spelling words that use what we call the complex code. Okay, so that's spelling, reading, decoding, and spelling embedded and correlating with each other. Following on from this, if I was going to be doing this, a similar approach in the middle to upper primary, and still looking at the letter U as an example. The letter U can make lots of different sounds. So I've picked some complex words here, and instead of saying the sounds, I would be modeling this in syllables instead. So for the word continuum, I would say the word is continuum. Let's say the sound or the syllables here, continuum. And I would model it first by writing continuum, so that they can see those 4 sounds, or syllables, I should say. You don't want them saying each sound by this point because on a cognitive load level and working memory level, it's just not efficient. And it's much easier to remember 4 pieces of information there. So I would continue doing this so that we have our list of complex words or challenging vocabulary. And I would be taking my words. If, for example, we did need to review this letter, I might choose these words based on that. But I am much more likely at this point in middle to upper primary to be selecting words based on content that we're learning in class. So it will be based on their units of inquiry, if that's what they've got, and they're doing their extended topic there, or if you're using a knowledge-based curriculum, they're both doing content and rich knowledge. So I would be taking my information from there and selecting words based on that. Okay, we're coming to the end now. I just wanted to show you some decodable resources that I came across. I know I've used structured literacy for a long time. I've done interventions using predictables before I had access to the amount of decodables that we now have on the market. So I have used some of the e-collection, which two of these books here on the e-collection, where we can see I could use the letter U here for my very early grade. I might be using this book here to show me how to segment and blend words. I might be using this as one of I think there's at least 10 books that would cover this grapheme art in the set 3, so that I've got lots of opportunities for practice. And then the further up I go, if I'm looking at you saying a sound like ooh in Pluto, I'll be accessing a book here to extend students. Either all students are doing tier 1 with Pluto in a tutu, or I may be using this text to challenge students who are ready for that challenge. I know I'm mindful of time because it's nearly time for questions. So almost finished here, Kate, just in case. I just want to come back to the learning intentions and just pop this in here. When you have the webinar that you're looking back on, or when you get your access to this webinar, I just thought I might point out that depending on the stage that your children are at in if they're in pre-alphabetic, partial or full alphabetic, you can change your learning intentions and success criteria to align with the phase that the students are at, even if it is just one letter, for example. And as I deliberately use just one letter and one sound or multiple sounds here to show you that different practical ways you can differentiate and distinguish what needs to be taught as critical content at this stage of reading instruction. And of course, then we would be moving into actual decoding, segmenting and blending, practicing using guided practice. Again, thinking of that practice model, we would be doing initial mass practice, and then it would be independent towards the end. Just touching on vocabulary, which we will expand on more in the next session on comprehension and text structure. This is another reader which has, quite often we think that decodables can have simplistic vocabulary in it, but for example, in this book, we've got the word scoffs because these two characters are out fishing and getting something to eat. And we've got the terms that can also be used to eat sitting here that can be organised and ordered. It's a great collaborative activity that students can do to sort of organise vocabulary to say, how else can we use these words, and to what extent would one word be greater or have a greater impact than another? Okay, that's a wrap. So what we've done today is we've reviewed the key components of structured literacy, as well as the explicit instruction, critical elements and techniques that we can use. We've looked at the practical pedagogical strategies that can be used in primary education, and the key strategies that I've highlighted are explicit instruction, structured literacy, the daily phonics review, purposeful independent practice that's used within explicit instruction. Some of this has been used in a multisensory approach, and also a little bit of feedback and assessment, but that will be covered more in the third webinar. Thank you so much for listening. I have a list of references here, but I'm now going to take you back to Kate for any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. That was amazing. We haven't got any questions in the chat at this point in time, so if you do have one...
Lucky I went over.
Lucky you went over, Jacinta. Please feel free to ask now. I wasn't sure if there was a raised hand there that I just saw. And just a reminder to everybody, while I'm just waiting to see if there's any questions coming through, that if you haven't, please do register for the next 2 webinars in this series, Unravelling Text Structure, which is on the 6th of June, and also Leveraging Formative Assessments, which is on the 20th of June, which you can find on our website. And Jasmine will add a link to in the chat of the website so that you can access it as well. Jacinta, I saw there briefly, if you wanted to flip back a slide just for everyone as well, you had your references there too, that they're there, and of course you'll be able to find those in the presentation as well. So I'll just jump on. Yes, sorry, and I've just seen Rebecca. Yes, we will be sending out a link of the recording of this presentation. So, and we've just got a quick question. There's 5 minutes to go. I think it's, excuse me for 1 minute. It's in the chat, just 1 second. EAL students in a grade 5 or 6 class, what advice would you give in attending to all students there, Jacinta?
Really good question. Okay. My experience with EAL is I would go back to the component of, I'd be looking at the 5 components here, and I would be saying, how much phonemic awareness and systematic phonics do they need? Your school screeners and assessments to see if there are any difficulties there would be where you would pick up if they need it. Quite often, that's not the case unless they're sitting in there. If they do have a difficulty with phonemic awareness or phonological awareness, then they may have difficulties with decoding, but they're more likely to have difficulties with vocabulary and knowing how to use syntax properly. So that would be in the writing component where you would, you know, when we talk about having really good modelled text and mentor texts, I would be selecting a mentor sentence and having a really good high quality mentor sentence that you can refer to when you're embedding syntax and grammatical goals that need to be implemented. If they're new, they need the high frequency words. Even the first 100, where you get almost all your function words, like your prepositions, and your who, what, when, where, why, and your pronouns, all those words there, they have to learn how to use those. So they can read them fairly quickly, but they have to learn how to use them in context. So their needs might be quite different to other students' needs. And I would be looking, if you have EAL students in your class using structured literacy, to ensure that when you're using a list of spelling words or vocabulary words, that they are using these words not for the purpose of spelling, but for the purpose of usage and making sure that they can use them properly. Hope that helps. Yeah, that would be my short answer to EAL. I think it's really tricky because they don't necessarily need, or they can learn certain components of language faster. They may not have the barriers there, but the vocabulary is where it will be really difficult.
Thank you so much, Jacinta, and well done answering that in time. I don't think there are any more questions at this point in time. So I think with 2 minutes to go, which will tick over to about 1 minute, I just want to thank you again. And thank you to everybody who attended as well. Have a lovely afternoon and a lovely evening, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks.
Thank you very much.